Hello, this is Timatin. I'm with the CiviCRM core team, and we're doing a new experiment in developer-oriented webinars. This is the first time we're doing it, so let's have a little bit of fun with it. The topic will be dynamic UIs in CiviCRM and Angular JS. I want to speak for just a moment about the Hangout Medium, since it's a little bit different. Hangout is designed to allow communications with a large group of people at the same time. And when you're communicating with a large group of people over the internet, things go wrong constantly. There are delays and lag and so on. So it's not quite possible for us to have real-time chat and interaction. However, if you look on the sidebar, you should be able to get access to a texting interface and to a question and answer interface. Michael McAndrew, who is CiviCRM's community manager, will be keeping an eye on that and pinging me about things that come through through another medium. All right, so quick outline for this session. We're going to do some background on what Angular is doing in CiviCRM, what kind of screen is it useful for. We'll do a quick run through with the code generator for how to bootstrap an Angular Civi project on your own system, and then introduce some of the Angular terminology. I find a lot of that stuff to be fairly bookish, so we'll try to get through that somewhat quickly and then get to more of a bottom-up tour where we'll go onto the command line, use a text editor, and build an Angular screen for ourselves. All right, so what is Angular useful for? Well, CiviMail in Civi version 4.6 got an overhaul, and a lot of that was possible due to our use of AngularJS. I don't know if you recall, but CiviMail in version basically at 1.x up through 4.5 looked a lot like this. It was a 5-step wizard. Going through each of the steps in the wizard was a full page refresh. And it got a lot of comments about how it was a lengthy process and it was fairly difficult for new users. To point out a few things here, you might notice the total recipients is on the second page of the screen, but that's not the page where you actually choose recipients. If you look at that number and you think, oh my God, 32, that's not enough recipients, then you have to go click the back button to view the select recipients page where you can choose a different group and then hit the next button and it'll give you an updated total to indicate if you're in the right ballpark. You sort of wind up going through a cycle of back and forth, and each step in that cycle is fairly slow because it requires a full page refresh. There's another similar cycle when you're working on the content and the testing. You compose a message, then you go to the next tab, you send out a preview email, and then you come back here, and then you go to the previous tab to fix your content. It's a very difficult experience. So we had a round of discussions and talked about how this screen should look. And there were a couple camps. In one school of thought, the idea was that we should have a single screen. You should be able to do everything on this screen. You might notice in this screenshot, we have the standard email fields like from, recipients, subject line, and then body. And you fill those out, and then you can hit submit mailing at the bottom. And everything else on this page is optional to drill down. There's another school of thought which likes the idea of a wizard because each step of a wizard can be a smaller step. And you also get a chance to take a tour through the features of the user interface. When you're looking at tabs like this, people often gloss over those tabs and don't know what's in there. And so they don't really understand the functionality that's available to them. The wizard advocates feel that doing a walkthrough gives better exposure to the app and helps people understand better what's going on. it was kind of tricky because we couldn't quite agree on which of these layouts was better. And I think it's biased a bit based on what kind of organizations you're working with and what kind of users you have. If you deal with smaller organizations, then having a single screen that looks a bit more like a standard email composition screen is nice because it's easier to get into and it feels a bit lighter. If you work at a bigger organization where they do mail blasts to 100,000 people every week or 2 weeks, there's a lot of pressure to make sure that each of those mail blasts is really quite nice. And so having a longer process actually forces people to pause and think through what they're doing before they hit the send button. What both of these layouts do, though, is that they try to deal with the fact that CiviMail has a huge number of options, right? It's a gigantic system. And you need some coping strategy. The wizard is one of those coping strategies. The tab bar or the advanced button are other coping strategies. Ultimately, what we wound up with in version 4.6 was support for multiple layouts in CiviMail. So there's a variant of CiviMail which displays as a single screen. And there's another variant of it which displays as a wizard, providing the grand tour. There's a third variant, which is the compromise. And we're actually using the compromise by default. It's a two-step wizard that tries to get most things into the first screen, but does have a second screen as a sort of pause to review what you've done. And then we have the multi-user workflow, which breaks down the steps in a way where you can assign different permissions to each step. So different users are performing different parts of the email composition. That's a fairly advanced one that you don't need to think that much about. And I didn't think to put it in this slide, but there's also the A/B testing workflows. There are 3 variants on A/B testing, and each of them requires composing 1 or 2 email messages. So all of those are different layouts of the same general concept of preparing a mailing. To support multiple layouts, we need to support a concept that has been missing in CiviCRM of blocks. Every CMS, every major development framework has some concept like this. Drupal, they're called blocks. In Joomla, they're called modules. In WordPress, I guess we use shortcodes a bit more, but it's the same idea of a reusable chunk of content. You can move it around on the page and position it a little bit differently depending on the organization's needs. And a great thing about AngularJS is that they actually have a standardized model for representing blocks, and it's portable, which means we can use layouts and blocks from AngularJS on top of any CMS framework where we deploy Civi. It's also not a block model that we have to define ourselves. It has prepared documentation, prepared semantics, and all of that. I know it probably doesn't seem all that radical to have layouts and blocks and these sorts of things. It's par for the course in most frameworks, but it's something that Civi has traditionally skimped on. So it felt a little bit radical to me when we were working on it. All right, so working with AngularJS, there's definitely some fiddly bits to get a page going, and fortunately we have a code generator which will do this in an extension. The code structure in the extension is very similar to the code structure in core. So we've done this a couple of times where we prepare new functionality for Angular in a Civi extension, and then later on copy it into core when we want to release it to everybody. And I just want to do a quick demo of working with the code generator. So there will be 3 commands that we run. The first command is making a CiviCRM module or extension. And let's go ahead and switch to another window so we can do that. All right, we're on our command line. We have a CiviCRM build set up already, running version 4.6. We are in our extensions folder, and the command civics is already available. If we do civics by itself, we get a help screen, and we can see civics generate module. Michael is reminding me that if you have any questions, please direct them through the online medium provided by Google Hangouts. All right. So we want to generate a module. And let's call this guy for CiviCRM Angular example. And the default author and email look good. Yes, activate the extension. And just to cover our bases, let's take a quick look in the browser. Here, hit reload. And we see the Angular example extension, Angular EX, is enabled. Okay, let's go back to our terminal. Right. So let's go into our Angular EX folder, take a quick look. Pretty much the standard files were created, info XML. Oh, interesting. So I think actually I must have already had this module around. I'm going to delete this and recreate it. Now, normally after making a new extension, we'd go into this info.xml, which has all the metadata about our extension, and find the fixmes and replace them with something real like. But since this is just a quick demo, we're actually not going to bother with all that. And normally we might take a quick skim through the Angular EX.php, which just contains a bunch of boilerplate for standard hooks in Civi. We don't really need to dwell on that right now. Let's proceed to actually make some Angular code. So civics again, get our help, and we see add a new Angular module. Now, Angular modules don't perfectly match CiviCRM modules. You can have one CiviCRM module with 3 different Angular modules in it. In a simple case, I think you'll often have only one Angular module for each CiviCRM module. So by default, if you just run generate Angular module without any arguments, it will create an eponymous Angular module. So we had called this org CiviCRM Angular EX, and it creates a file angular.js.css.ang.php. Let's take a quick look at those 3 files. The first file is a bit of metadata specifying what JavaScript and CSS to load. Increasing my font, hoping that this stuff is still legible through YouTube's compression algorithms and all that. It's a pretty simple file. Loading the JS, you can just give wildcards to load everything in the Angular EX subfolder. You could also do wildcards for the CSS, but we're not really doing much CSS today. So moving along, we're not really doing much CSS, but if we had specific CSS for our Angular screen, we could put it in here. We are going to do some JS, and Angular requires that you declare a module along with a list of dependencies in Angular. So this module has 3 dependencies by default. The first dependency, CRM UI, provides some standard layout, some standard visual elements for CiviCRM. The second one, CRM Util, provides some backend services that are helpful in preparing a page. And the third one, NGRoute, allows you to define new pages, which we'll do next with our other code generator. So civics without any arguments, and we can see generating an Angular page. There's a question coming in about whether let me get this right. One Angular module can be used in multiple CiviCRM modules. The answer is that yes, it can be used in multiple CiviCRM modules. So if hypothetically we had an Angular EX and we had Angular EX2, it would be quite reasonable for the second module to depend upon the first one. We're not actually doing this right now, so I'm going to delete that snippet. Civics. Generate page. To generate a page, we're going to need to specify a symbolic name for the code, the controller that we're creating, and a path where it will be displayed. An important thing to note about the path, which comes up in the help here, is that the path is relative to CiviCRM A, the Angular base page. All Angular pages that are bundled with Civi go under this path. So let's call it the, let's make a page which will, I don't know, we'll just call it hello. All right, so it makes a few files, and let's take a quick look at what that visually looks like, and then we can go through the code. Are. So we go to the Angular base page A, and I believe it was /hello. All right, so it's got 3 panels in here. You know, just some informational stuff, some more informational stuff, some text, and if we type in it, screen updates. Hello, my name is Tim. It's doing a greeting based on my first name. All right, so let's go back and poke at the code behind this. All right, so in our Ang folder, in Angular EX, there are 2 new files. Hello control HTML and a JavaScript file. The HTML should look fairly straightforward. As before, we've got about 3 major sections: the help block, the greeting block, and then the about me block. And inside the about me block, we have some input elements where we're typing in content. I don't want to dwell on the markup that we're looking at here because we're going to go through the dictionary and do a build up from the ground up of how this code works. All right, now there's a question coming in from Chris. Let's go see what that question is. All right, question. I'd like to know how we can make pages that aren't in CiviCRM/A, e.g. /donate, or beautiful URLs. What might we need to address to deliver that? Okay, so the question, there are two parts to that question. The easier part to that question is to assume that we want to make other pages that are underneath CiviCRM. So CiviCRM/donate or something along those lines. There's a base class that is used within CiviCRM for the /A page. You can basically look at that base class and imitate it to set up a new base page. This is something that we haven't done in the past. I don't view it as a major development activity, probably a day's work to really hammer it out so that it's something nice that other people can work with. But basically, we want to take the same base classes and reuse them for a new Civi route. If you don't want it to be under the CiviCRM folder and you want it to be under the CMS's folder, then that's a slightly longer discussion. And I think we want to move that one to email or to a mailing list. All right. So I think that's about it for a quick code generator. Let's get back to our presentation. So glossary, Angular terminology. Module, we touched on that briefly. CRM UI is a library of UI elements. CRM mailing is the module which defines the new Civi mail screens. CRM mailing AB is another module which builds on top of CRM mailing and which defines the AB testing experience. And we have a naming convention within core where all of these modules are prefixed by CRM. In Angular, there's a naming convention where all of the upstream official code is prefixed by NG, ang. And as we saw earlier, when you declare a module, you use this helper function, angular.module, you give it the name, and you give it a list of dependencies. Route. Hopefully, if you've worked with other development frameworks, you've come across the term route. If you've lived in the Drupal world for a long time, you might not have seen the term route. In Drupal, it would often be called a menu entry, and in Civi, it's also called a menu entry. Basically, it's a record which says this URL maps to this piece of JavaScript or PHP code and this piece of HTML code. In Civi's PHP framework, we automatically map between the JavaScript file, in the PHP framework, we automatically map between the PHP class and the Smarty template. In Angular, the mapping is not quite as automatic. You explicitly declare the name of the class and the name of the template that need to be associated with each other. The controller is a piece of JavaScript code which runs as soon as the user requests the route, and it's responsible for maybe loading some data or setting up some helper functions which will be used within the page and generally controlling the flow of the page. A partial or an HTML template is a small snippet of HTML. Each page has a partial for its top level. You will also use partials for smaller chunks of content, for blocks or reuse or directives, which we'll touch on in a second. Directives. All right. So when we were looking at the HTML, you might have noticed that there were a bunch of tags and attributes that weren't standard markup. This is because in Angular, the major piece of glue for composing a screen is called a directive. It's basically a custom tag or a custom attribute that modifies the way a tag works. And these have meanings, like a tab set can contain a list of tabs, or a text area. You can turn it up into CK editor or TinyMCE or some other rich text editor. And so these directives will always have some JavaScript code which defines what that attribute means. It will usually have some HTML code as well, which defines how you manipulate the appearance. A quick note, that in HTML and in JavaScript, directives take a slightly different form in their names. HTML, you use dashes to separate terms. In JavaScript, they use camel case. Injection is a very important concept in AngularJS. The idea with injection is when you're writing some code, so when you're writing a new controller, you need to interact with some service like the CRM API, and you have it injected. Angular will figure out where CRM API comes from and what exactly it means, but you need to declare that you want a reference to it so that you can work with it directly. There are very few global variables or global classes. Almost everything in Angular is passed around through the injection system. The thing that we inject is usually called a service. So CRM API is a function that you're working with in the top chunk of code. CRM API is also a service, which is defined in the second chunk of code. And if you know anything about CRM API, it's basically a thin AJAX wrapper which does an HTTP call to a certain endpoint, and it encodes the request as JSON, and then it decodes the response as JSON and passes it back. I think this is the last concept that I wanted to touch on, but it's also a very cool and important one in Angular, and it's called a binding. And bindings allow you to say that JavaScript code is directly related to something in HTML code. And when there's a change in one of them, it updates the other one automatically. So in this example, we have in our JavaScript code a variable called scope.mailing, and it contains ID, subject, body HTML. In our HTML, we display the mailing subject as a read-only value, and we also display an input field where you can edit the subject. This input field is pre-populated based on the data from JavaScript, and if you edit the input field, then the JavaScript object will get updated, and any other things on the screen that use it, like the title and the H1, will also get updated. It removes a lot of boilerplate when you're doing form processing in JavaScript. So it's a pretty neat feature. The feature of binding applies to both data, and it also applies to functions. So in our second example of binding, at the top, scope.save is a function which uses the API to send some stuff to the server and get a response back. In the UI, we have a button which is related to the save function. As soon as you hit that button, it will go back to the JavaScript and execute that code. Oh, forgot one. Promises. If you've done much JavaScript, there's a fairly good chance that you've come across promises in other contexts. In Angular, we use them all the time. So if you haven't, it's good to get a quick recap on promises. Traditionally in JavaScript, you often had a helper function where you supplied arguments to include in the AJAX call, and then you gave a success callback, right? Now, the problem with the success callback is that you can only have one success callback, and if you have several AJAX calls that you need to make in a row, you wind up with a lot of nesting. So you can imagine that first chunk of crossed out code, if you have to do 2 AJAX calls, you take that entire chunk and you duplicate it inside it, right? And if you have 3 of them, then you wind up with 3 levels of this. And you get very deeply nested code, which can be fairly brittle and hard to read, right? Promises, in the simple case, look about as long, right? Like if there's only one call, it looks about the same. So you might not see the advantage. But I pointed it out there just so that you get a quick sense for how promises work in their most basic form. Here, var p is a promise that represents the eventual return of a mailing, the mailing 123. And once it returns, this additional function is going to get called. It may not return immediately. It might take 10 seconds. But as soon as it does return, we'll call the other function. What's cool about promise notation is the chaining. In this example, we're issuing a total of 2 API calls in sequence, and we don't have to get extremely deep in the nesting of the code. So the first call retrieves mailing 123, then we print out the content of the mailing, or the subject of the mailing, and then we issue another API call, and we wait for that to finish, and then we print out the results from the other API call. All right, so that's it for the bookish glossary stuff. A lot of those concepts you can also find online in standard Angular JS tutorials. If you get into Angular, I think it's a good idea to skim through some of those tutorials. But we will try to give you a quick demo of how to actually write some of this code from the ground up, just to reinforce what each of these concepts are. Now, to do that, we're going to need some kind of example application to work on. And I think we'll do a simple screen where you can edit the current user's list of email addresses. Right. Now let's clear out this auto-generated stuff, because we didn't really understand what's going on when stuff gets auto-generated. And it's a bit clearer if we can build these pieces up by hand. All right. Actually, I kind of regret deleting the auto-generated code. There was a piece of that I wanted to copy, because I can never quite remember how to write it. So I'm going to regenerate that. All right. We're going to make a new controller called the edit email controller. And we're going to start by copying a little bit of boilerplate here and down here. We're going to declare a route. This is an example of injection with the route provider service being injected to our configuration function. Our configuration function uses this service to register the new screen. And I probably messed up a little bit on that, so. There we go. Looks more like it. All right, so this we're going to call edit email. Controller is called, it's going to follow a naming convention, edit email control. And our naming convention will also have the HTML file matching controller name. I deleted that other stuff because we're not going to touch it just yet. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. Now we need to make the HTML file. Let's do a quick hello world. And I'm going to try sharing more of the screen here so I don't have to flip back and forth quite so slowly. If folks have trouble reading this now, please feedback on the chat. Check the chat. See if I'm missing anything important. All right, that's enough of the infinite. Okay. So our page is edit HTML. It's relative to CiviCRM A. I'm doing a reload to make sure that the latest JavaScript is available, and now I'm going to the new page. The reload is somewhat important because when you transition between pages that are after a hash mark, it might not actually get the latest JS. Got hello world. Excellent. What's our next step? We want to put in some fake data. We're going to make a fake person and give them a fake name. Okay, so let's make our controller Angular EX. Controller. Copy the name of the controller from over there. The controller is a function. Oh, okay. Someone says my screen sharing seems to have stopped. Let's see if we can fix that. All right, is that any better? I'm going to assume so because I'm not getting any complaints. All right, we're back now. Okay, so we want to make a fake person. And if you've used Civi's API, you've probably retrieved a contact record and you know some of the common fields, which are like ID 123, display name. Let's go with Alan Alda. And that's probably about all we need. That. And then in our HTML, we say hello contact.display name. Go back to our web page, load. Uh-oh, that doesn't look right. What did I do wrong? First, check with Firebug, see if there were any errors that came out. There is an error. Scope is not defined. Uh-oh, what's that about? What is this scope thing anyway? Okay, so I said $scope.contact, and that's true. If I look up, if I search on this page for $scope, it's only one place where $scope is referenced. It's not defined anywhere. Scope is a special variable that needs to get injected by AngularJS. And essentially, it defines all of the data and all of the functions that are shared between this piece of JavaScript and this other piece of HTML. So now that we've defined scope, let's hit reload again. There we go. Hello, Alan Alda, and no errors. All right, let's make this a little more interesting. Let's show a list of fake email addresses. So scope.emails equals an array. And if you've used Civi's data model, you probably recall that email addresses are not simply strings. They're actually records in their own right. So you have an email with an ID and something like alan@gmail.com and a location type. And let's give him 2 emails. Then we want to list out those emails. So we're going to make an unordered list. And here we get to use an Angular directive called ngRepeat. Now, ngRepeat is kind of cool because it will reproduce the HTML for each item in a list. We want to go through each email. I believe that's the notation. We want to say, this is going to be a little bit confusing having the word email everywhere, so I'm going to change emails to email records. The record is the entire thing, and then email by itself is just this string. For each email record in email records, email record.email. Reload. And uh-oh, that's not working. Probably because there's a typo. I hope it's because there's a typo. It was because of the typo. All right, if we actually spell things correctly, then it gives us our list. A quick tip when looking at this data, there are several pieces of information floating around on the screen, and you might want to know how exactly to reference those pieces of information. There's a debug tool that we've included. So you might say email, let's debug email records. And then we want to go to the same page, but append a special code, Angular debug equals 1. And I need to hit reload. And now we get a new panel up at the top. If I click on that, then it gives a data dump of all that information, which probably doesn't seem that interesting because it's fake data that we made up just now. But when it's real data that's getting sent from the server and it starts to look a little different from how you expect, then it's really nice to have that debug. All right, so let's make this email list editable instead of just displaying. And we can do that using the input tag. Hit reload. And now we have input boxes and they're populated with our data. If we look in debug, we can see our data. And here's where it's kind of neat. If I start editing this to fix the address, then you can see in the debug panel, it's updating automatically to reflect the data we've typed in. All right, let's delete an email as well. Let's also add an email and delete an email. Okay, so adding an email, we're going to need a button of some sort. And when someone clicks the add button, we need to run some kind of JavaScript function. Yes, we need to run some JavaScript function. Now, remember that scope is what defines everything that is shared between JavaScript and HTML. So this piece of code, this function needs to be shared. We're going to define it on the scope. I often like to give the name of the function twice. In certain browsers, the debugging and the error messages will be clearer if you define the function name a second time there. So to add a new email record, we do push, and we're going to push a blank one. So ID is null, email is an empty string, location type ID is 1. Hit reload. And we now have an add button. If I click add, then it keeps adding more ones. If we look in here, we can see that our list has been updated with more content. There was a question about translations, TS. I will try to punt that to later. If we look at the code that is generated by Civics, it actually does address TS. But I'd like to get through this first. All right. Just to quickly demonstrate if Alan is also if we actually put in data, we should see that that data is what shows up. All right, now let's allow deletions. And we just want a small delete button. We could do a button again. And when someone clicks it, we would say, delete this email record. Voice delete, reserved word in JavaScript. We'll find out. When you delete, you're not just deleting ambiguously. You have to delete a specific item. And I just want to make sure the button is hooked up correctly because I just do things in small steps. And the button is not hooked up correctly. All right. I think it might be because delete is a reserved word. I'm going to rename that to del. Search and replace. Okay, so this time we hit reload and there's no error, and we have our delete buttons. I'm going to increase the font size to try to make this a little more legible. It might also make some parts of the screen funky, but that's okay. We're on YouTube. That's what we have to do. All right, now to delete, we just need to get that item out of the array, right? And unfortunately, so I'd like to say is email records, delete email record. That's not quite how you do it in JavaScript. You have to have a position in the array, and you do like splice. I probably should have made a note about how to do this beforehand. JavaScript array splice delete. But let's search Google for it. It's a very common question. All right. So we need the index of the item that we're going to remove. And if the index is not -1, then we do this splice. OK, so I'm going to say var index equals take our array, which is email records, got index of the email record that we want to get rid of. And I might make a typo in there, so I'm going to copy paste. Now, if the index is greater than 1, array.slice email records. Oops, my bad. So that's going to go to the indexed position and remove one element. OK. Let's reload our page and give it a try. No JavaScript errors. Yep, that's a good sign. Hit the delete button, and it disappeared. If we go over to our debug panel, we can see that that element is gone. If we want to add it back, then we can create a new one and see how that looks. But then again, who really uses Outlook? So let's get rid of that. All right. That's about all we can do with our fake data. Now we need to start hooking it up to some real data. Instead of hard coding Alan Alda, let's look up the current user. All right. Now, how do we look things up? We want to use the CRM API, and lookups are a fairly common thing when you request a page. So you can actually, I don't know, how do I want to say this? A fairly common use case. This isn't quite how we're doing it right now, but a common use case would be to have a page like localhost CiviCRM A hash emails 123, right? And you'd be looking at a list of email addresses for contact 123 or email addresses for contact 456. You might use a slightly different convention. Might do that. The point is that there's a piece of the URL, this 123, that's a variable that we need to read off of, right? And if that variable is malformed or if it contains an illegal ID, then you can't really show the page at all. So The way Angular addresses this is that it handles the lookup for that ID, or generally for other data that you need to prefetch as part of the page through the routing system. So we have this resolve function, and we want to look up the contact. And to look it up, we have to define a function which will take some information. We can actually inject lots of different things. So we can inject the route and get information about that. We can inject the current location and use fields from the URL bar. In this case, we're always going to load the current user's information. So we don't really need to read data from the route. We just want to use the API. We just want to do a call for CRM API, contact, get, ID is user contact ID, right? And because we're using CRM API, we need to remember to inject it. Let's hit reload. Make sure it didn't add any major syntactic errors. Yeah, page still looks about the same, no errors, that's good. All right. How do we get the contact that's been resolved up here as part of the routing system down into the controller? The answer, as often is the case in Angular, is through injection. At the start of the controller, we have our list of all the things that need to be injected. Okay. We've loaded the contact, and we want to get rid of this dummy data and instead use our real contact record. Hit reload. Now, that's kind of weird. We've got a blank. That means it's not getting any data out of the contact. Well, it's doing AJAX stuff. I don't know what it's returning. Maybe it's some weird format. I want to be able to debug this a little bit. So I'm going to add another panel up at the top here so we can debug the contact record. All right, so we now have a new debug panel in contact. Oh, right, the API call has a wrapper around it. It's not just the contact record. I think, though, if we call the API a little differently, we can get what we want. Instead of doing a get, we want to get single. There will only be one user contact to deal with. So we reload again, and now we see hello admin@example.com. Well, that is my contact's display name. I'm going to quickly fix that so that we have something that looks a little more realistic. Ooh. All right, now we'll reload this page, and it should show an actual display name. Hello, Tim O. In our contact, it says, hello, O Tim. Hello, Tim O. Hello. Okay, that's enough. So we've got a real contact. Now we're going to use the resolve trick again to get the list of email addresses. This time it really is a list. It's not just one record. What they all have in common is that they have the same contact ID. And instead of using this dummy data, rid of that and use the emails. At this point, that would be invalid. The emails is not defined within this function because we need to inject it. Let's reload. And that's pretty weird. I don't really have a whole bunch of blank email records. What are we seeing here? Ah, yes, there's container again. And we want an array of email records, which is really the content inside of here. So we're going to change that to be sequential, true. And then we're going to change, oh, I'll do sequential true, hit reload. We're not quite there yet, but it's good to see what we've done. We've changed it so that now values here has an array and no key value pairs at the top level. Right, and then we want email records to come from .values. Hit reload. And now we have the real email address. If we dig into email records, we can see it is a proper model with contact ID, location type ID, and all of that other nonsense. All right, so how do we save this, right? If I add another one, CiviCRM.org, in the list, but I mean, it's not going back to the server. It's got this null ID on it. We need something that really sends a list of email addresses to the server and saves it. Let's create a button called the Save button. And we need to define that function, scope.save. And we can use the CRM API again. Now, the verb that we use for this is maybe not one that you use a whole lot, but it's a fairly powerful one. There are several verbs in the API, right? Like create, which will insert one new record or modify an existing record, delete, get. There's also a verb called replace, which is a list-oriented action. And the idea is that you define some variable that all items in the list share. So all of them need to involve contact ID based on the current contact. And then we have a list of values, which is based off of scope.email records. And when you do this replace action, it will actually reconcile the list that we have in JavaScript here with the list that is stored on the server. That means it will search for all of the contacts who have the current contact, excuse me, it will search for all the emails that belong to the current contact ID, and it will compare that list to this list. If there's something new in our list, it will insert it. If there's something modified in our list, then it will update it. If there's something that's been removed or is missing from our JavaScript list, then it will delete it on the server side. So let's hit reload. And let's add another address. And we'll hit save. No, it's giving us a warning. It says CRM API is not defined. So we fix that the way we fix any errors like that. We need to inject it by going back to the top and updating our list of inputs. All right, so let's reload. Do it again. Software development requires a lot of reloading, a lot of patience. Add, and back to CiviCRM.org. Save. And now this is returned without any errors. And if we go back to view our contact in the normal screen, scroll down, we see 2 email addresses. If we delete this guy, hit save. Go back here, hit reload. Now there's only one email address. So our save and our delete and our add are actually working. All right, this might be a good moment for me to pause and see if any questions have come up. So I guess there's a question about translation, which I had punted on earlier. Translation in Civi and Angular is handled through a function called TS. So instead of outputting the string hello, what you want to do, say output hello, like that. It works basically the same way as TS does in our PHP and Smarty code. There's a problem, though, which is that this TS function has not been defined in our scope. So if we hit reload, we're going to get some kind of error. We get no message. Oop. I need to re-enable screen sharing. Okay, so what I've done is I replaced where it said hello contact display name, the function call to TS. And if you're familiar with TS in Civi's PHP code and Smarty code, this is basically the same thing. Unfortunately, when I reloaded this page, it came back and it wasn't displaying anything at all. That's because the TS function is not visible within our scope. We need to explicitly do something like scope.ts equals a function of some sort. Right now, fortunately, there is a service that will take care of this. I believe we call it that. And we need to tell it what module we're working with. This is a piece of boilerplate that gets auto-generated when you use Civics. So I actually don't recall if that's right. If it's wrong, we'll have to go look at the example. But it's right. Now the TS function is defined. And if we were to switch to French and if the extension had translations, it would be loaded. All right, one last bit. I want to show some of the UI elements that are defined by default in CiviCRM. These are not standard Angular JS elements, the ones we've added. And to get a listing of them, you can go into the source tree and take a look at Ang and crmui.js. We have here our first example, an accordion. Right? It comes with a small snippet of HTML for how to display an accordion, and then a definition of the directive, which you don't actually need to use. I'm going to copy that example. Let's just see if the example works verbatim. Scope.crm UI accordion is undefined. Great. I'm just going to quickly double check that we are correctly using our accordion notation. It got changed, and the documentation, of course, wasn't updated. Yay! I'm going to fix that right now. All right, so when we did a search to find the accordion as it was actually used by other code, that gave us a working example. And now we can do that. Let's rename it to emails. All right, if I hit add, that's good. Our visual hierarchy is a little bit off. This should be inside the emails container. Save button should be applied to everything. Great. But you know what? Maybe accordions aren't quite the right way to go. Let's do a tab set. Let's search for C. So in our CRM UI.js file, we can just search around for common elements and see what we find. I did a search for tab, and here's an example of a tab. Okay, not a very complete example. What else do we find? This looks a little more complete. That's probably right, but it's all been crammed into one line, and I'd like to see maybe a full working example. So I'm going to do search and take a look at that guy. So we have our div tab set, and within the tab set, we have a tab, and we scroll down. Let's see, follow the indentation. It ends here. Then we have a tab that's been disabled, and we have a few more tabs. CRM UI tab. This is probably the most concise example of a tab. All right, so let's copy that over. Do that. Let's make two tabs. Let's make a general about me and an emails tab. Move our email list over here. All right, so now we have a tab set, which contains two nested tabs about me and emails. Let's see if this works. And we have two tabs. If we go over here, there we go. Make this a little more symmetrical. Let's do that really does update the display name, at least on the client side. And one more widget. This will be the last widget. And then I think we can wrap up the session. So the last widget I want to touch on is called the wizard. And a wizard is a multi-step process where you go through several steps in sequence. In our crmui.js, we can find an example here. And I'm going to guess this is correct. Being a wizard up at the top. A little bit better. The wizard, it has two steps, step 1 and 2. All right. Reload. And we have an error. Miss something. Just verify that location hasn't changed. I need to provide weights, I think. And title. Still getting this compilation error. You might need this. I think that's optional, though. That's interesting. This example doesn't have any arguments there. All right, well, the wizard, I don't think I'm going to get in the next 10 seconds. So I will leave that for another time. It does give you some notion that right now the documentation hasn't been worked out for a lot of these components. And the best way to get access to them is to find other examples in the code base. All right. Let's see. All right, I think that's about it for now. We've gone over by 20 minutes. So for those of you who are still with us, thank you for watching. If you have more comments or questions, please follow up on the mailing lists or the developer forum. And thanks.